So, welcome back to Profit Visibility Lab. So, every week we examine a single modeled case, and we're looking at a founder problem, not to judge to say whether or not a decision is right or wrong, but really just to look at the operating system and see what the business is telling us to better inform decisions. Our objective is to understand how the revenue system creates the conditions under which these decisions are made. So let's get into it. So we're looking at an environmental pressure. So we're looking at an environmental pressure that you may be experiencing as a founder that is around increasing operational complexity, right? So today's goal is, again, we're not evaluating the founder. We're not we're evaluating the operating environment, okay? So our investigation begins with one question and one question only. What is the question? What evidence does the business currently provide, and what evidence is still missing? Okay? Everything that follows must answer this question. This is the way we roll here. So, first we have a situation that we're evaluating. We have a founder that has spent several years building a successful business. Demand has increased steadily. Larger opportunities are beginning to appear, and one opportunity in particular looks very attractive, okay? It has potential to significantly impact revenue. And accepting that opportunity, however, could have some implications, of course does. It requires additional commitments, okay? And those additional commitments look like expanding delivery capacity, increasing payroll, investing in new systems, and potentially financing future growth. So none of these commitments appear unreasonable. The opportunity itself seems legitimate. The uncertainty is elsewhere. We're looking at if the revenue system has produced enough structural evidence to justify those additional commitments. Okay? So what do we know? What do we know? At this stage, we have evidence supporting the following observations. Demand has increased. Larger opportunities are becoming available. The founder is considering these larger commitments. Operational complexity is increasing, and decision weight has increased. So, and these observations are what we would consider facts. Okay? They establish context. They do not, however, establish conclusions. Okay. So, why this decision feels different is that we have visible costs and we have invisible costs. Okay, so visible costs are things like hiring and systems and capacity and capital, payroll, at hiring new people and things like that. Okay, these costs are easy. You can calculate them. What we can't calculate are these invisible costs. Okay, reduced flexibility. I take on this big client. Yeehaw! How is that going to affect my existing operations? Increased operating pressure, greater dependency. Right? The bigger the client, the bigger the dependency. And a narrower decisions, room for decisions, because now you have to account for something new that wasn't there before. And then, less room for experimentation. Can't be as flexible as when you're running things out of your hip pocket, right? So these costs often remain hidden until much, much later, okay? So before we decide, let's separate out some things. Because what happens is, let's talk about them first. So first, let's separate out the opportunity. This is something that appears possible that has value to the business. The commitment. There's some resources that have to be allocated in order to support this. there is evidence, which is what has the business actually demonstrated. And then there's a decision. Only now do we decide after we have those other things. So what I notice is that as founders, what we tend to do when a big opportunity comes up is we go, yeehaw, we got a new client that's coming in on board. Let's figure out how to do it. But really, what that does is the emotion collapses all of these aspects that we're looking at, the opportunity, the commitment, the evidence, into one big, how can we do it? Not let's consider it, right? So let's look at what we're missing, some missing evidence. So our investigation still lacks these things, right? We don't know the revenue consistency. We don't know what the demand quality will be like. We don't know the capacity utilization, like how much of our team do we need to augment this? Because we don't necessarily know what it's like to work with this particular new client, right? We don't know delivery resilience or cash flow implications or the customer concentration is how is it going to affect other things in the business, right? When we collapse all those into a single decision that says, woohoo, we got it, right? But without understanding these factors, confidence is incomplete. So that doesn't make the opportunity bad. It simply defines our current boundary of visibility, what we can see. Okay. I like to say that uncertainty is not the enemy, right? It's not uncertainty. It's hidden uncertainty. Business is about uncertainty. We're always going to have things we don't know. But what we, or things, well, I'm going to say that we don't want, that we can't foresee. But hidden uncertainty is the challenge, right? So then we ask ourselves at this point, we know the founder question. We know what remains uncertain, but then the question is, well, okay, how do I get some level of certainty on those things that are uncertainty or that lack visibility in my business? The revenue system, where inside the revenue system should we investigate? And for this, the operating grid allows us the ability to locate. So let's check it out. Okay, so when uncertainty becomes visible, it can finally be evaluated, right? So here, when we're looking at the operating grid, in this same scenario, there's 4 different lenses potentially, right? So when we look at demand in the spotlight quadrant, then this is about, are these opportunities evidence of a healthy demand system? Or are they isolated opportunities that only appear to justify the expansion? So in other words, is this opportunity aligned with your focus on what you've been generating demand for? Or is this, a flash in the pan, new something that you're going to have to move heaven and earth to accommodate, but it's a really big deal? That's the question. Then the next question is, if we look at the offer quadrant, there's another lens that says, do we really understand what this commitment is going to require from the business? In other words, we know we need additional capacity maybe, and we need to throw in a new kitchen, for example. But what we don't know is what impact that's going to have on our existing operations. So that's our existing commitments to the business, our existing clients, our existing deliverables. How will this new one impact the ability to deliver to those? The other one lens is if we look at our capacity, which is in the activate quadrant. And this is, so if tomorrow this new client comes on board, the founder says, yes, yeehaw, let's do it, then will we have the operational capacity to deliver consistently? And depending on the nature of the business, this could impact a whole lot of things: quality, capacity, the procurement. All these things can be affected. And then finally, in retain, we're looking at, has the existing customer base given us enough evidence that the business can actually sustain this next level of commitment, right? And all of those are questions that we at least will know how to locate with the operating grid. Now, notice something important. The operating grid did not tell us the answer. It showed us where to look. As we work through these questions, a pattern begins to emerge, not because we guessed, but because the evidence points us there, okay? The evidence points us there. So it looks like the revenue system is sending us a signal, right? But it's not saying don't grow. It's saying, can we support what you're asking the business to do? Okay? This is a very different question. And growth is not being rejected. We're just requesting some evidence because we want to know what's really going to happen to the business. We don't want to be 90 days down the road or 6 months down the road and not able to make payroll because we didn't anticipate that, for example, the payment terms and how it was to operate with the specific client. You know, if they're a slow player, how was that affecting us, right? So there are things to consider. Now, what pattern best explains the evidence? So we have 2 categories of evidence. The evidence we have and the evidence 2 categories of information, the evidence we have and the evidence we don't have, right? So the evidence we have, demand has increased. Larger opportunities are appearing. Operational commitments are becoming larger. And the decision weight has increased. This much we know. But what we don't have evidence for yet are the revenue predictability, how the capacity is going to be able to adjust, how the cash flow is going to impact the business, what our tolerance is for the impacts of the cash flow, what the operational stability is going to be, and we still don't know demand capacity, right? So notice what happens when these 2 groups are viewed together. The business is increasing its commitments faster than it is eliminating uncertainty, right? Increasing uncertainty. The structural tension. That's the structural tension. Okay? And that's why we're doing the investigation. So, we're looking at this pattern, commitment before clarity, because the founder accepted an opportunity. Yeehaw! But the pattern revealed because the pattern reveals itself, I should say. Pattern is the behavior that we're seeing. It's asking for commitments that exceed our current level of understanding or demonstrated evidence, I should say. The opportunity may succeed. It could fail, right? We don't know. We don't know. But neither outcome changes the structural observation. In other words, what we know and what we don't know. So the pattern exists because commitment is advancing more quickly than visibility, right? Now, why does this matter? Why do you care? Because revenue predictability depends on it. It depends on the quality of our decisions. So as founders, we want repeatable revenue. The way we get to repeatable revenue is through good decisions that are made based on the evidence that's being provided to us from the business. To ignore that or to overlook that based on excitement because yeehaw, we got this new client, is to set ourselves up for disappointment. So our flexibility decreases, the recovery costs increase, the assumptions become more expensive, and we get weak signals and they become harder to detect. So when commitments consistently outrun evidence, repeatable revenue becomes increasingly difficult to create. Now, and it's not because your demand disappeared necessarily. Could be, but not necessarily. It's because the confidence is disconnected from the structural visibility. I'm confident I can do it because I've done it in the past, because it's a great opportunity, because someone said they would help me, right? But not necessarily because of the structural evidence that we can see within the business. And that's what we want to evaluate. Okay. When does revenue stop being repeatable? Okay. All right. Get to my notes. All right. So our primary signal has never been about effort, right? We're not lacking in effort. But we do want to understand what pathway we need to be on to create the repeatability. So if the business appears healthy and the founder appears capable, the opportunities appear legitimate, but a new commitment is supported by less certainty than visibility than the previous one. That gradual separation between commitment and understanding our structural visibility is enough to introduce instability into the revenue system and hence result in non-repeatable revenue. For example, if that opportunity is not one that you're generating based on what you define as the operating model for your business, it's kind of a one-off that's great and huge and has a lot of prestige aligned with it, but it's not aligned with your operational delivery model, that will mess you up, right? So to use like the simple vernacular. So the result is not immediate failure. It's not going to happen all overnight, but one day you'll sit up and you'll say, oh my gosh, how did that happen? It's because of this declining predictability. Okay, so let's summarize this investigation. So we didn't begin by asking if the founder made the right decision or not. We began by asking whether the business had produced enough structural visibility or evidence to support the level of commitment that was being required. Throughout the investigation, we established some evidence that demand is increasing, that larger opportunities are appearing, that decision weight has increased, that operational commitments are becoming larger, and that complexity has increased. We know this, right? We slowed down enough to know that. But we still have unknowns. And this will be the case, right? So we have revenue predictability is unknown, and a lot of these other things that we mentioned previously around operations. So the finding here is that we identified a gap between clarity and our commitment to this new client or this new opportunity. The opportunity itself was never determined to be a problem, right? The problem is that the commitment is increasing faster than our ability to have visibility into the evidence, right? Our structural visibility. And that relationship is defining the character of this pattern. Now, what can we say with confidence? What can we say? The evidence supports a conclusion that operational complexity has changed the nature of founder decision making. Larger commitments now require stronger supporting evidence. Visibility has not matured at the same rate as the opportunities, perhaps, and the commitments that we make align with the opportunities. And this creates a variability inside our system. So, what we cannot yet say, the investigation does not conclude that the founders should reject the opportunity. We didn't say that. It doesn't say that the business is unhealthy. It doesn't say that growth should stop or that failure is inevitable. No, none of that. All we're saying is, because those will require some additional evidence, right? And we don't have that evidence. But the diagnostic discipline requires us to at least stop, separate out those components, and examine the evidence and where it sits and where it stops. So, this investigation supports one pathway to reduced revenue predictability. In other words, well, what's going to happen if we do this deal? As operational commitments increase ahead of structural clarity, the assumptions become more influential, the confidence becomes less evidence-based, There is operational variability that increases, and revenue becomes more difficult to forecast and repeat because we're introducing these variants within it, which with each decision that we make that has that gap between clarity and commitment. Okay. The business may continue to grow, right? But the system becomes progressively less predictable. Okay. That answers the primary signal for this week. So as we wrap this up, what we've concluded today is that not that we don't continue to make decisions as we go forth and find great deals and great opportunities, but just that we slow down just a little bit and evaluate these opportunities against what the evidence of our business is showing us. And in being able to do this, in ensuring that we're looking at that evidence, we manage or we mitigate the risk of having downstream implications that were lagging indicators that we could have seen had we just looked at the evidence that the business was telling us about. Okay, so with that, we're going to wrap things up. I encourage you to tune in tomorrow for more detailed explanation of the pattern. We'll have a detailed post on tomorrow, Wednesday at 11 a.m. to give you a little bit more detail about the patterns that affect this and that will help you identify what it takes to know how to assess a decision about growing your business. So with that, I encourage you to see more, guess less, and always diagnose before you deploy. Bye for now. Okay, so that wraps up this week's Profit Visibility Lab looking at Am I Ready to Grow? Check out the post tomorrow at 11 a.m. on my profile that gives you a little bit more detail into the behavior of the pattern that we talked about today. Gives you a little bit more detail into how to identify the pattern that we explored today. So, with that, I encourage you to always see more, guess less. And with that, I encourage you to see more, guess less, and always diagnose before you deploy.